We first spoke about battery swapping when the finance minister spoke about it in the budget of 2022, saying that, hey, we're going to be focusing a lot on EVs in general, but within EVs, battery swapping is a focus area for us. And that's something that we're going to draft a policy and put it out. So Niti Aayog actually put out a policy, a draft policy on 20th of April, which is, I think, coming out of draft now because the last day to submit, comments on that was 5th June. And since then, I think they've published a new policy on. They've published a new policy, and that's the policy that I refer to understand what's happening in this space. Let me set some context, right? The move to EVs is something that every country right now is focusing on. One of the reasons is obviously the oil cost is through the roof, right? And it shows the heavier dependency that a country has on oil, the more chances that you're going to go through some economic turmoil because $100 and $100 a barrel, $120 a barrel has a significant impact on the overall economy. So that plus the whole focus on climate change has resulted in this rush to adopt electric vehicles as soon as possible. The flip side to the rush is obviously substandard products coming out in the market. We've discussed that briefly earlier. That's not going to be the focus of the topic today. But in order to make the EV adoption happen very fast, one of the biggest bottlenecks is infrastructure, right? If I buy an electric vehicle, if I buy an electric two-wheeler or electric car, where do I charge it, right? There's this term called range anxiety, which is if my electric vehicle can only go 100 kilometers and I need to go 150 kilometers, what happens, right? Where do I find a charging station? Because there's no infrastructure in India for EV charging stations yet, or not at a scale.
I just want to give an example here. All the Bombay people that I speak to about buying an electric vehicle, their only question is, will my new EV drive me to Lonavala or not? That's all they care about. Can I get to Lonavala?
Yeah,
For
exactly.
for the non Bombay people, Lonavala is our favorite hill station, and if we
Yeah.
can't get there, what's the point of living here?
Exactly. So that range anxiety will basically result in lesser people adopting to EVs, and that will mean the infrastructure that needs to be developed is going to be pushed further, right? Because it's a chicken and egg problem. Unless you have enough EVs, the infrastructure cost can't be met. Unless you have enough infrastructure, people will not buy EVs. That's where the government decided that if we want to increase the pace of adoption for electric vehicles, we need to come up with a standard which is basically something called as battery swapping. Why is this important? Two reasons why this is important. One, battery swapping is basically easy to set up, significantly easy to set up compared to the infrastructure for charging stations, right? Think about the time, space, and cost angle. Time, obviously, charging stations, you will need to spend 30 minutes, 40 minutes in a charging station if it's supercharged, if it's super fast, right? There was a story where Tesla has obviously done a phenomenal job of setting up these charging stations across the US. And there was a story where last Memorial Day, I think that happens January, February, whenever that happens in the US, a lot of people were out on the long weekend and there were 3 hour waitings at the charging station because sure, it works in your normal times, but it does not work in peak travel times where everybody's on a road trip, right? So
Yeah.
and that in the Indian population context is going to be a nightmare. The government has understood that charging stations per se are going to be very hard to scale. Plus, you need a lot of space for charging stations, right? Because as part of charging stations, you need to go park your car or your two-wheeler or three-wheeler there and then charge it. So you need a lot more space. And from a cost perspective, it is significantly more expensive to set up these places, which is where
And
the government said, yeah, yeah.
In India, we don't have that space, and India is one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world when it comes to land in general.
The other reason why battery swapping is extremely important, the government has identified this, is if you compare electric vehicles to combustion engine vehicles, the thing is electric vehicles over their lifetime might be cheaper, right? Because less maintenance cost and less repair cost, all of that. But the upfront cost on electric vehicles is significantly higher than combustion engines. And in a price sensitive market like India, that matters a lot. The reason why the upfront cost is so high is because of the battery, right? Now, by doing battery swapping as a focus area, by figuring out battery swapping, what the government is also trying to do is doing something called or implementing something called as battery as a service, which is basically you get the vehicle upfront at a certain cost, and then the battery is basically a subscription of sorts, right? So think of it like you fuel your vehicle every 2 weeks or every month. You will be paying a cost to a battery provider who you've subscribed the battery from, and this is the exact model that Bounce has come up with. Bounce Infinity is an electric two-wheeler electric vehicle company in Bangalore, based out of Bangalore, and now they've started delivering across India. So they have built this entire model where the battery comes as a service. So it's a subscription cost which you pay monthly, I think, and that you get the vehicle on an upfront cost.
I have a question for you, Siddharth. I don't know if you have the numbers for this. I would love it if you do. So let's say an electric scooter costs around 1.25 lakhs, right? For the Ether one. And the battery is around 40 to 50% of that. So that's around 60,000 rupees, let's say, for a battery. So let's say you take it as battery as a service. So you buy the scooter itself for only 60,000. What is the monthly charge that they're putting on these kind of batteries?
I have no idea. Bounce has a battery subscription for 850 rupees with a 35 rupee cost for swap. So every time you swap a battery, you have to pay 35 rupees and then 849 for the entire month.
So that's 10,000 rupees a year. No, yeah, that's around 10,000 rupees a year. So that's 60,000 over 6 years, and 39 rupees. Let's say you swap it, I guess once a week, twice a week. I'm not sure how often. Let's say you do it once a week, right? Let's take it at 100 rupees. No, sorry, it was 39 rupees, right?
Yeah.
So 50 rupees, just to make it easier, 50 rupees times 4.5 for a month. So for a year, you're doing it fine, 2,500 rupees a year, right? So
Yeah.
around 13,000 rupees per year. So you're recouping the cost in around 4.5 years. Okay. Yeah, I can see
Yeah.
that's a viable business model. Okay. Sorry. I just want to
Yeah.
get understand the math.
Exactly. So I think these two reasons, one from a cost perspective, time, space perspective, and also to increase the adoption and not put the load on the end consumer to pay for it upfront. These are the two reasons why battery swapping becomes extremely important. But it's not easy to pull off, right? Because you're dealing with multiple different players. You're dealing with battery manufacturers, you're dealing with OEM manufacturers who are going to be producing these two-wheelers, you're dealing with people who are going to be setting up these battery swapping stations. So standards need to be set across the board. So interoperability standards are extremely important when you talk about battery swapping. And a great example of interoperability is the phone charging cables. I have no idea which charging cable is called what. I just can look at it and say this will work with my phone or not, right? It's all over the place, and I don't know if you've heard the ruling. I think by 2023, everybody in EU has to come up to Type C
Yeah.
battery chargers, which is apparently a big blow to Apple because they were not using Type C, and they make a killing out of selling that charging cables, I'm sure.
Yeah. In fact, if anybody's listening to this, even within Type C, there are multiple types of chargers. So, for example, I use a MacBook Air, and MacBook Air is a charges using a Type C charger. But if I try to charge my phone or some smaller device with it, it'll cause an issue. So, even within Type C, you have to make sure that you use the correct cable and the correct charger. So, yeah, that's something that I learned recently and which scared me.
Exactly. I've definitely charged my phone using the iPad and the MacBook charger. But anyway, coming back to our discussion, right? So, interoperability is a huge problem that needs to be solved. And one of the things that I like in the entire policy is if you set standards, if you set interoperability standards, it can also curb innovation. Now, we're talking about an industry that's very nascent, that a lot of innovation needs to happen in the battery chemistry itself to make it more efficient, to make it more advanced, right? So the government is saying that, hey, we are going to set interoperability standards, but not at the cost of market innovation. We are going to still give you some room to innovate, and there might be a couple of interoperability standards that will be set up as long as you can build the entire ecosystem around it. So the policy, basically, what it talks about at a very high level is, give me 1 second.
Can I just go into depth about why interoperability is important?
Yeah.
Because let's say you are driving a Tata Nexon and somebody else is driving a Mahindra. I think Mahindra has one, right? Mahindra XUV electric or something like that. And you guys both want to go to get your battery swap. Now, the battery swap, dealership, let's assume it's a dealership, right? Um, they can have they have two options. Either all the batteries are the exact same and they just swap it back and forth, swap it back and forth, or they keep an entire stock of XUV car batteries. They keep an entire stock of Tata Nexon batteries, and that makes the entire business model much less viable than just having the same battery and just taking it out, putting it back in. And anyways, if I'm not mistaken, this battery swapping is more focused towards two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So your scooters, your rickshaws, that kind of stuff. And building that interoperability is going to be really critical to make sure that EV adoption in that space becomes a lot more, um, goes a lot further, because these markets are also a lot more price sensitive, right? Because scooters would rather
100%.
pay less.
100%, right? So, if you look at the vision that the policy wants to achieve, interoperability is a huge point in the entire policy. They want to build the entire ecosystem. The word ecosystem is used multiple times, and I will just paint a picture on what that ecosystem really means. It's the OEM battery manufacturer, the battery provider who's going to buy the battery and then supply to the end consumer, or to the manufacturer so that it can come installed at least. And then there is people who are going to be managing the charging stations or the swapping stations. They're called BSS or BCS, battery swapping stations or battery charging stations. There's a captive battery swapping station. There's a captive battery charging station, which is if for certain types of cars there needs to be a captive, they will need to invest and they will need to build the entire ecosystem. But the government wants to promote the entire ecosystem. And one of the big focus on that policy is to regulate this industry to de-risk it, right? And that's an important point to understand. Once you put regulations on it, at least the entire industry knows that the government approves of XYZ things. Without a regulation, everybody is playing in the dark and the risk is high. Now, how does that matter? The reason why this matters is your finance costs are dependent on the risk that is there in the industry. By de-risking the industry, by making it very clear on what the standards are and what the government is setting out to achieve, the finance costs are going to be much lower. And I bet you need a lot of money to set up the infrastructure for swapping stations and stuff like that, which is why the government is saying we want to make sure it's affordable, both from a finance perspective and insurance perspective, and therefore these standards become extremely critical. And then one of the last things that they spoke about is by doing it the right way, we might even be able to solve the recycling problem, right? Because different kinds of batteries, if they have different means to recycle, again you have the economics problem at the recycling stage. By doing it at a certain standard, your recycling also becomes more economically viable.